Hello, I'm Carrie Murray, President of ShelterBox USA, and I'd like to welcome all of you to the ShelterBox War in Ukraine one-year webinar. So many of you that are online today have made the work of ShelterBox in Ukraine and also in places like Moldova possible over the past year. I've just returned from Ukraine over the weekend, where I was joined by a ShelterBox response team. This was Team 10. Over the past year, ShelterBox has been working to help people displaced by the war in Ukraine. And today we'd like to share with you some of that project work and give you just a purview of the work that you've enabled over the past year. I'm very pleased that today I am joined by two of the response team members that were with me in Ukraine. They have visited the country and the region several times, and they'll be here to answer a lot of your questions about the work of ShelterBox over the past year. So last Friday was actually the one-year anniversary of the war, and it was on February 24th, 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine. And what we saw was a series of airstrikes, a series of missile strikes, even paratroopers that invaded the country from outside of Kyiv city as they tried to overtake Kyiv, to places like Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest cities, to areas in the east. And what we've seen over the past year is tens of thousands of buildings have been damaged or destroyed. Thousands of people have been killed, and millions of people have been displaced by the crisis. It was 1 year ago that we deployed our Team 1, and it was in early March of last year, and we deployed to Poland, and we were starting our coordination efforts in Krakow, Poland, with many other aid organizations that were working to try to quickly mount a response to what would be the fastest moving and the largest refugee crisis situation since World War II. So our teams were working, and this was actually a photo that I took in Przemyśl at the train station at the border in Poland, and it was the first stop for tens of thousands of people that arrived every single day. Millions of refugees made their way over to countries, including in Poland. And what we saw at the time were really mostly women, mostly children, elderly, disabled, and they took oftentimes an upward of a week or more just to make it over the border to the spot of safety. And they brought with them little more than the clothes on their back, maybe a pet, and they oftentimes left family members behind. And that's because men were conscripted into the army between the ages of 18 and 60. And so families were literally ripped apart in the moment. So fast forward 1 year later, and I think little did we know at the time when we were deployed in Krakow that our work in Ukraine over the past year would be one of the largest pieces of our work in the past year at ShelterBox. We've been able to bring emergency shelter and/or aid materials to over 37,000 people who've been affected by the conflict, and our current programs that we were facilitating last week and through the winter will reach a further 30,000 people. So today I'm going to share with you more about those projects. We're currently on Project 5, but first I would like to introduce you to our panelists today, who are all part of the ShelterBox response team. First, I would like to introduce you to my colleague, esteemed colleague, and the director of our programs in Ukraine, and that is Rachel Harvey. Rachel, you are a former international BBC correspondent. You have 30 years experience in the aid, delivery, and global media sectors, and you've deployed over 20 times for ShelterBox in some of the world's worst disaster and conflict situations. So you were in the Philippines after Typhoon Haiyan, in Fiji following Cyclone Winston, but also in some of our large-scale conflict responses, including Iraq, Somaliland, Ethiopia, and Cameroon. And obviously, most recently, your return this weekend from Ukraine. Rachel, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm so thrilled that you could be here.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'd also like to introduce you to another colleague who is equally and differently as accomplished, very uniquely. Tim Law is the head of safety and security at Shelterbox. He is a brigadier general in the British military. He's got a very long and accomplished service career, graduating from the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, working in the Royal Artillery, and stationed everywhere from Afghanistan, Bosnia, Northern Ireland, Germany, Australia, and most recently serving as the secretary to the Joint Chief of Staff in Beijing, China, where you covered the Hong Kong protests, as well as getting all of the British nationals out of China during the COVID pandemic. Tim, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure, thank you.
So I'm going to dive now into the programs of Shelterbox over the past year, and I want to remind all the audience members that please, we'd love for this to be a great dialogue today. We want to get your questions answered, so feel free throughout the webinar to text and chat your questions into the chat box. We have already received some, and we'll be sure to answer those throughout the webinar. So the focus of Shelterbox. So as a global humanitarian relief organization, Shelterbox is focused on the provision of emergency shelter and essential aid items to really help families recover when they've often lost everything or been displaced in an instant due to some of the world's most significant disasters, but also conflict situations. And it's been really the fastest growing piece of our work at Shelterbox has been in response to violent conflict and war, like you've seen in Ukraine over the past year. So just looking at the sheer numbers, I don't think any of us have seen anything like this in terms of just the scale and severity and how fast moving this crisis was of displacement. So just looking at the map of Ukraine and looking at those orange areas off to the right on the eastern side of Ukraine, we saw a lot of the initial bombings initially hitting outside of Kyiv City and Kharkiv, and also in those red areas to the east, northern and southern areas. And what you saw was people moving from eastern Ukraine to western Ukraine. And so our first really piece of information for us was that this is a fast moving conflict where people are moving west. Some of them are staying internally displaced within the country, but millions of people are also fleeing outside of the country. So what you see is in areas like Lviv in the far west of the country, you had millions of people turning up in collective centers, places like schools and churches, but people were fleeing to just get out of the violence. And so 1 year later, what we've seen is now over 13 million people have been displaced, both internally and as refugees. 7.5 million people are now living as refugees all across Europe. And we have a humanitarian situation 1 year later that's staggering. So there's 17 million people right now that need humanitarian assistance who've been affected by the war. That's nearly 50% of the population. It's just over 40%. It's a very, very large number. We have people internally displaced. You have many people returning, oftentimes to damaged homes. And then you often have people who are remaining in their damaged homes throughout the conflict. So Shelterbox set off 1 year ago to really try to meet the displacement needs of a variety of different types of displacement. So people internally displaced first was our focus. And Rachel, this was our project one. And I know at the time, really what we wanted to address was people who were fleeing their homes, but were sheltering in places like churches and collective centers. And what we're seeing here are some of the mattresses, right? Thousands of mattresses. Can you share with us just the utility of these, how they were used and the importance that they played for the lives of these folks that were still remaining within the country?
The essence here, Kerry, was really speed. It was trying to get those people who were on the move and who, as you said, had left with pretty much nothing, maybe a suitcase, a backpack, trying to grab what they could, trying to find a safe place for them to bed down for one night, a few nights, a week. At that stage, none of us had any idea how long these people would be displaced. So trying to get some sort of bedding down that could be quickly used. So you haven't got time to build beds. It would be too difficult to get that sort of material into the country. But these Thermarest mattresses are really good for just putting a base layer down. Then you can add the blankets, the sleeping bags, all the other bedding on top. So our major contribution at this stage was these mattresses into collective centres. Other agencies then supplemented with other goods. So it was a way of getting a lot of people served as quickly as we could.
And this was a local community-based partner, People in Need.
Yeah, People in Need, we've worked with them in other countries around the world. They are an international NGO, but they tend to work at a very local level on the ground. And the great thing about People in Need in Ukraine for us at the time is that they had had a presence there since 2014, so since the earlier Russian invasion. So they had a really good network, really good contacts on the ground, and we were able to plug into that.
Great, thank you. Next, in addition to focusing on the immediate needs of people who were internally displaced, I know that there was really a desire to help families who are now sheltering in damaged homes and helping them in the moment with the specific household items, but also the kits that they need to help repair some of the homes. And so would you mind just kind of sharing what we're seeing here with our next partner, Relief Aid?
Those look to me like classic shelter box shelter kits. So see how many times we can say the word shelter in the next 45 minutes. Within those packs are the basic materials that you would need to patch up light damage to a house. So if you imagine, if you look here, the tarpaulins, and then weight those down, secure them, the fixings we would supply, the tarpaulins we would supply, and the tools to try and fix those together. And you can also see in the windows, clear plastic sheeting that's been used to seal those off. So it's very simple repairs that can be done quite quickly. You can see some of the damage. Tim would be better able to speak to that, but some of that looks like some kind of shrapnel damage in the side of the building. The roof was probably taken out by a missile strike. So it just enables people to make those buildings weatherproof and to seal them off. It's not a long-term solution, but it's just a patch-up job to keep people going and to enable them to stay in their own homes so they don't then have to flee.
And that's often what we saw, was that people really wanting to return to the communities that they were from at any cost, and oftentimes with nowhere else to go. So repairing homes that had been damaged was really crucial. And this was more summer months to fall. Is that right, Rachel?
That's exactly right. So these kind of light repairs were still timely because people were trying to patch up. The photograph you can see on the left there, that, I think I'm right in saying, was one part of a house, and the family were living in the other portion, which had been less badly damaged. But that patch-up job enables that part of the house not to get any worse. So if you get damp in that side of the house, that could spread to the other part of the building. So it's all about trying to keep the house as weatherproof as possible before the worst of the rain and then the snow and the cold weather.
So you mentioned obviously tarpaulins, but other things you mentioned just the plastic sheeting to cover up those windows, as well as foam sealants, which help create that additional barrier.
That's right, and we've been doing that again more recently with slightly more enhanced shelter kit, adding in those extra elements, adding it also in wooden battens just to be able to create wooden window frames and door frames. You could also use it to do the framework for a roof, so pretty versatile. And adding that sealant foam, that expanding foam that I'm sure lots of people on this call will be familiar with. We didn't have that in those original kits. We added that because it was suggested as something that would be useful and people were asking for it. So we adapted the kit to what people were telling us.
Great, thank you. The third project that was running really simultaneously to these projects, we're now focused our attention to families that were fleeing the country. And again, this was the fastest moving displacement crisis since World War II. Millions of people fleeing to the neighboring countries, places like Poland, places like Moldova. And as an aid organization that really wanted to focus on the needs of the most vulnerable, I know Rachel and Tim, we turned our attention to the country of Moldova. And we had a very different type of intervention and aid package here. So can you talk maybe first about why Moldova and what we were seeing as people were coming across the border and some of those needs and where they were staying?
Tim, maybe you want to go first since you were there at the time and I picked it up later on.
That's a very good point. Yes, I was actually part of the first team that deployed actually in March last year. And at first, when we put our security plan together for the deployment, it was unsure or unclear about where we would go. I think at that stage, it was unlikely that we were going to go into Ukraine because so many people were needing and leaving, and the need was so great to the west of the country. But we quickly identified when we were in Krakow that many of the EU nations were able to get quite quickly gain access to European Community Humanitarian Organization funding and were able to coordinate quite effectively. Moldova, on the other hand, is not a member of the European Union, wasn't quite so able to draw from that pool of expertise and resource. And so it was quite evident to us that Moldova represented a great opportunity for Shelterbox to find a place where the need perhaps was unmet in more of a way that Shelterbox would be able to help deliver. So I'll pass over to Rachel now because I think she knows the details of the project that eventually took place.
Thanks, Tim. It was designed to be something light and mobile, because one of the things that we anticipated was that people weren't going to hang around very long in those border camps. They were going to come across and then be absorbed into other parts of Europe. And that's exactly what we've seen. So the key things that we identified that people would need was a light hygiene kit. So it sounds really simple, but makes a big difference. Things like toothbrush, toothpaste, soap, face flannel, face cloth, small basin, lightweight kit that people were literally handed as they came across the border initially. Then later on, we followed up through our partner ACTAID, and they went round to those transitional camps to hand out more of those hygiene kits. The other element for this package was cash, and that was absolutely critical because it's really difficult when people are on the move like that. You don't know exactly the conditions they've come from. You don't know exactly where they're going to end up. So trying to give them anything that's too heavy if they're going to be on the move, there's no point giving them shelter kits. There's no point giving them big thermal blankets that are very voluminous. Best thing to do is give them cash and enable them, empower them to make their own decisions about what they need and when they need it. So it was multi-purpose cash and delivered through a system that was very careful to register people, get their IDs, ensure that it was the right amount of cash for the right people. So that has actually went on for several months afterwards, but was a really successful way of helping a lot of people, again, pretty quickly.
And can you tell us about the makeup of these families and what you saw?
Well, as you identified, by far the biggest majority of people who came across the border were women, children, the elderly, and the disabled. So you had a big gap in the middle of men of essentially a fighting age. That was the missing ingredient, but otherwise it was mostly women and children. Often you would see grandmothers, mothers, and then one or two children with them. That tended to be the demographic profile of people on the move.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things, if I may, actually, is that in the first few days, the majority of people that were leaving Ukraine were people that had contacts in the West. And a lot of those people were able quickly to move away from the choke points that were presented by the border and get to the places that they were trying to go to. And in many cases, that was within Poland or sometimes within Germany, sometimes beyond, sometimes even as far as the United States. But as the evacuation or the exodus of people from Ukraine continued, some people left that didn't have that capacity, didn't know where they were going to go. And for those people, cash really was a lifesaver because they didn't have those contacts in the West.
And so many of these families, at least coming across, I think we saw the absolute generosity of so many people across Europe and lots of host families taking in people they'd never met before and really helping them. In places like Moldova, they didn't really have a lot of extras to begin with. So providing these families as well with some of the multi-purpose cash allotments to help just give these families a boost who were doing something so important at the time. So we're now kind of halfway through the programs and probably a third of the way through the year. And what we've seen so far is a real evolution of the type of aid package we're providing, really to meet the unique needs of the families that we're serving in the moments that they're in. And I know that a big part of the year was planning what we would do in the winter. And I think having been there, and it can be brutally cold. It's a long, cold, unforgiving winter in the region. And we were particularly concerned about families, again, in Ukraine. And I know we turned our attention back to Ukraine on helping people then survive the winter and really adapting the aid package. And you had mentioned that, Rachel, in terms of the enhanced repair package. So I'd love to talk next about what you did to prepare for this, but then also kind of how you pivoted when you went back a few months ago around how we needed to prepare for this winter.
Yeah, the first phase of that was close coordination through the cluster system. A lot of agencies were planning. We were all discussing. I was part of the winterization technical working group, which sounds very grand. It was actually just a bunch of people like myself brainstorming and trying to work out what would be the most useful kit that we could bring in, and again, to do it quickly. And time was of the essence. So one of the key things was thinking, you could try and rebuild, you can try and get more substantial roofing, but that takes time and it takes a lot of money. And shelter boxes, we specialize in that sharp end, immediate emergency relief. So we went for what was called an enhanced acute emergency kit that the cluster had recommended, which is the same basics of tarpaulins and that clear plastic sheeting, but now adding in extra tools, so hammer, saw, wire clippers, some extra bits of thick wire to twist around, adding in that expanding foam, but also the wooden battens that I was describing earlier, and then different types of nails, so masonry nails, concrete nails, different types of fixing to make that kit as flexible and as usable as possible. And the idea, again, was to get that to people as soon as we could before the winter. As things turned out, a lot of people then changed their plans because Russia started targeting the power infrastructure. So people who at one time might have thought they could make it through the winter in a very lightly damaged building, for which our kit is absolutely ideal, that's fine if you still have heating. As soon as you've lost power and you have no light and no heating, suddenly light damage becomes much more critical to the building. So people then were on the move again. They didn't want to stay in those homes. And our kits were less appropriate in those more accessible areas that had been freed from Russian invasion for longer. So we had to pivot with those kits, and they are now starting to go out in areas much closer to the conflict line, where that patch up, that kind of quick patch up, is still appropriate. In terms of the other material, it was literally all about keeping homes and people as warm as possible. So stoves, a supply of firewood, thick thermal blankets, and solar lights. That was the main focus of Project 4. When we went out in November, it was clear that the gap in provision of those kinds of simple items was huge. And that was what was going to be the critical need to keep people going through the winter. So we started Project 5 with a new Ukrainian partner and brought in a whole load more stoves and a whole load more thermal blankets, added sleeping bags to that mix, so you've got a double layer of personal protection in the warmth, and more solar lights. This time we went for a different lamp, because our solar lights work brilliantly when you've got long summer days and you could charge them up. In the winter they will charge, but the charge doesn't last so long. So we went for a different type of lamp that you can either charge through solar or you can plug it into the electricity. So two options for charging up, and it has a USB slot so people can charge their phones. So again, we were responding to the context, responding to what people were telling us, and adapting to fit.
Yeah, and we've heard and seen a lot of that. And Tim, maybe you can comment on that, because there has been such a major target, right, of hitting critical infrastructure and power infrastructure, and the impact that has on these families. And as we've seen this, it's really been widespread around the country, and presents a really difficult situation for these families. But you experienced it while you were there last month, is that right?
We've had several experiences of having to be in a bunker for one reason or other. Principally false alarms, actually, because generally the air raid sirens go off in Ukraine whenever aircraft that are capable of carrying long-range bombing devices take off either over Belarus or over Russian airspace. But there have been several times where energy infrastructure has been struck. Most tellingly for us, I think the second day that we were in Kyiv on our November deployment, we pretty much sat through a whole day's worth of a bombing of infrastructure around Kyiv. We didn't hear anything ourselves, but after that day, there were a series of rolling blackouts that were instituted for the Ukrainian people, sometimes as much as 50 to 60% of the day not being connected to power. And that's quite challenging for people in cold environment. So for us, it wasn't that much of a deal. We were prepared for this. We brought things with us that were low on power requirements, but also we bought a lot of charging equipment so that when there was power, we were able to operate. But for the Ukrainian people, that was a real challenge.
Yeah, particularly these families. And I know that we get asked often about beneficiary selection and the types of families that we're working to serve. And I did want to share with you some of the people that we've been able to reach with the support of so many of you that have enabled this work. I'd like to introduce you to Olga and Dina. They are best friends and they have been neighbors for 40 years in the same apartment block in Ukraine. And their lives changed, and that is their apartment that you see here on March 4th of last year. They said that there was shooting and missiles and shaking all night, and they went to the basement where Olga and Dina spent the night. When they came out from the basement, the house was without, and the apartment block was without all the windows. And they said nothing was left of the windows. Dina had her cat in her lap, but when the tanks shot, the cat rushed and she rushed away, and she's never seen her cat since. And while Olga and Dina's exact apartment block where they were located was not directly hit like you've seen in the center, it suffered a considerable amount of collateral damage to the building. So there was no power, no gas, no running water, and a lot of broken glass. And so with no windows, no heating, and temperatures dropping to zero, they had no alternative but to stay in their heavily damaged building like so many. But that is exactly, they said, where they wanted to be. Their home needs significant repairs, and they have been provided shelter toolkits and just necessities to make their home somewhat habitable again. But they've received tools, tarpaulins, and materials to help cover some of the broken windows and fix some damage temporarily. But they've also received the high thermal blankets you mentioned, Rachel, and also the solar lights. And that's what Olga and Dina said really brought them the most comfort during a really dark time, was having the solar lanterns that they were able to charge out in the day in the sunshine. So Olga and Dina are really indicative of the type of people we work to find and work to support through our project in Ukraine. And they are just two of the tens of thousands of people the organization has been able to reach over the years. There's a picture with the solar lights. So moving forward, both Tim and Rachel, you were there in November. You came back from the project. You reached out to all of us and said, we need to do more. We need to modify an aid package. We have to absolutely do more to help these families survive what will be a brutal winter. And this, again, was largely due to the fact that there were massive outages of power, heat, and obviously lack of running water in many instances. So you created what will be now our Project 5. And I think what's really interesting about this project, and we had a chance last week to meet with the partner, is our local partner is community-based partner with a lot of different arteries throughout Ukraine and a lot of local channels and community-based groups that help them with the identification and distribution of these aid materials. So can you tell us a bit more about our latest partner? And then I'm going to share some photos of the warehouse and obviously some of the aid items that we were distributing last week.
So the new partner is called, it's a bit of a mouthful, so bear with me. It's the National Network for Local Philanthropy Development, and it's part of the Global Community Fund. So you're right in saying that they have a limited, small, full-time staff, mostly based in Kyiv. Some of their bigger affiliates around the country will also have some staff members, but a lot of it is based on volunteers working within those local communities. It's very, very grassroots. But they have a presence right across the country, which is one of the great attractions for us, that they were really embedded at the local level. They had that geographic reach right across the country. And also critically, they have really good relations and connections with local administration, local government. And that really makes everything so much easier. They've been working not in humanitarian response, but in things like governance, accountability, rights awareness. They've been doing that kind of work before the war. Now they've had to flip and turn their attention to humanitarian work, much like so many other organizations in Ukraine. So from our point of view, it was a really good, and remains a really good partnership. They've got the local contacts, the local networks. We bring for them the technical knowledge, the humanitarian experience, the knowledge of the sector. So we had some really, really good discussions with them when we were out this last time, and you were there, Kerry, to see some of those distributions. It's great. The way they wanted to learn, they were asking us, are we getting this right? We think we could have done this better. What do you think? Just so refreshing to see, and to be able to support this kind of local organization that we hope, even after we've gone, they will then have been upskilled to be able to approach other organizations, maybe to continue this kind of work, and will understand more about the broader humanitarian sector and how to do these kind of distributions, which they've never done before. They're learning as they go, and we're supporting them with that.
Yeah, and these local community-based partners will be absolutely critical to community recovery long after the headlines have faded and the long-term recovery starts. Yeah. So we're looking here at the warehouse in Berezan in Kyiv Oblast, and this is where we had spent some time working on some of the mini kind of distributions for the day. And so we're looking at everything here from high thermal blankets, high thermal sleeping bags, there's solar lanterns, there's clothing, and in the far back, you can see obviously the wood stoves. And these are just some of the packages that were put together. One of the other partners I want to talk about now is our partner Rotary. We spent some time, we met with PAF's DG in Kyiv City, and Rotary has been absolutely instrumental in so many of our responses around the world, but providing information, providing critical resources to be able to do this ongoing work. But they've really been an important tie that binds our work in so many places. So Rachel, maybe you can kind of touch on that and some of the good work Rotary is doing in country.
They are so busy with their own projects in Ukraine, as you might imagine, in much the same way as the Network for Philanthropy. They're well embedded in that local community level. Some of their clubs are not operating at the moment. So, for example, in Crimea, that club is not really functioning because Crimea is currently under Russian occupation. But most of the clubs around the country where they can are operating, and they're operating at a very local level. We've been in touch. We met with Sergei when we were out in Kyiv. I now have regular monthly meetings with him just to share information, catch up on his projects, let him know what we're doing. He has another colleague, Nicola, who sometimes joins those calls. I know Alex Yulton, our liaison with Rotary, is also caught up with them at some of the international Rotary events. So we make sure that we keep them informed and in the loop of what we're up to. As it turns out, they had a project, Sergei and his Kyiv Rotary Club, in the village of Moshun, just outside Kyiv City in Kyiv Oblast. They'd been working there, providing modular houses. We then, in Project 4, also supported families in that same village, providing stoves, winter blankets, clothing, and so on. So that was a really nice complementary projects that Sergey was absolutely chuffed when he found out that we were also going to be working there and complementing the kind of work that they'd done before.
Yeah, really complementing each other's work. You know, I think one of the things that really struck me 1 year later, and I was asked this quite a bit when I've come home, is that what are the differences a year later? And I really just feel it's the breadth and depth and the enormity of the humanitarian needs, and seeing nearly half the population need assistance, and the fact that many people are still on the move. And one of the things that really struck me during some of our distributions was meeting the families who oftentimes are living in dormitories. We heard about new dormitories that are being created. I met a family that we did a distribution, this distribution actually right here, this is their stove and blankets. But a family that came from Severodonetsk in Luhansk, and they had 15 minutes to flee. And they left with literally the few things they could carry, and they made it to Berezan, and they had been living in a basement with 60 people and 1 heater, and it became absolutely untenable, and it was freezing and cold, and they were eventually able to secure a small apartment. But the basic things that they need for survival were things that they didn't have. So a basic stove, the blankets, the sleeping bags, some clothing, and obviously the solar lanterns. But this family, I'll never forget when we were speaking to the translator, and I asked, you know, would this make a small difference in their life? They hugged me all at once, and they had said, you know, it's super. And they had, you know, and for me, it's kind of these little wins of just helping people in the moment they're in with just some really basic things, but truly basic for their survival in the moment. And I think just being able to show them that we're there and we are supporting them any way that we can, but also when we're there, really working to understand what can we do better? How can we continually evolve the aid package and improve on the types of support that we're providing to these families? So I'd like to now, and I have some photos of some of the families that we've been able to serve, and you can see just some of the significant damage their homes have faced. But I'd like to go to some questions now because we have several, and Tim, I want to start with you because so many folks want to understand just the logistical challenges of doing this work, but also the safety and security concerns that you have to take into account to enable the teams to work there. So would you mind just kind of going through kind of the things that you think about very intentionally prior to enabling the team to work and just some of the logistical challenges of doing this?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that for all the challenges that are presented to people like us traveling into places like Kyiv and elsewhere within the country, that's nothing compared to the challenges that people within Ukraine are having to deal with on an ongoing and daily basis. And for us traveling in and then traveling back out, you know, even though that is in itself quite a difficult thing to do, you know, that's nothing in comparison to, you know, what other people are facing. But from our own perspective, we put together very, very stringent security plans and conduct a wide-ranging audit, I guess, or analysis of a bunch of factors prior to travel, so that we understand whether or not the situation has worsened and what the tolerance threshold is for the people that are traveling. On this particular on these most latest deployments that we've had, where we've gone quite a long way into Ukraine. I mean, Kyiv is a good 7 or 8 hours drive from the Polish border. As your president, President Joe Biden, found out on his train journey last week, it's a very long way and you can't fly. So you do have to travel a long way over land. In those circumstances, you do present yourself as somewhat of a target. And that's not to say that people in the NGO community are going to be targeted by either side in this conflict. But what you can be is collateral damage for something that takes place in another mechanism for targeting. I think for me, one of the main problems is the fact that you do have to get in and out of Ukraine by road or by train, and it's a very long journey. And when you have long journeys, that means that people get very tired. Driver hour legislation is not the same in places like Ukraine as it is in the European Union, in the UK, or in the United States. So you'll find that people are perhaps less able to deal with the rigors of transportation. And just for you people listening, 60% of all NGO incidents worldwide are down to transportation. So they're road traffic accidents, they're things to do with tiredness, they're things that happen on the road, maybe a carjacking or something like that in cities around the world, particularly in Latin America. But in Ukraine, a lot of challenges have been really, I suppose, in two areas. One is in road traffic accidents, and one is in when vehicles have hit explosive ordnance that has been left behind as a remnant of war. So either an unexploded bomb that has been that's failed to detonate when it hit the ground, or indeed the very large number of mines that have been placed. And I read somewhere recently that 30% of the country has been impacted by the placing of mines, which, when you think about the size of Ukraine, it's quite an extraordinary amount. So all of those things were taken into account. It's the first time ever in Shelterbox's history that we also took account of the potential for a tactical nuclear weapon to be used by Russia, obviously the only side that has them. And you know, although it seems very outlandish, and yes, I agree that the likelihood of that happening is very low, the impact of it happening is so high that we couldn't just sort of set that aside. So we were even taking, you know, daily senses of what the wind direction was, so that we could understand whether or not it would be in Russia's interests to detonate a nuclear device over the country. And that, you know, was also brought into our planning. So there's an awful lot of planning that took place. You were a victim of that planning, Kerry, in the sense that it took very much out of your working day to attend meetings to determine whether or not we would be able to go ahead. But equally, you saw that coming to fruition when we made a safe entry and exit into and from Ukraine in the last couple of weeks. And, you know, that entry was by road and the exit was by rail, just like your president. So, you know, it's an interesting experience and something that we put a lot of planning into.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think it was probably within the first 30 minutes of us entering into the country by car when the first air raid siren alerts went off. And this is something that is just a horror and terror of the war, and the fear that it inflicts on people is just awful, but it's part of everyday life. I mean, pretty much every day we were there, routinely, these are going off, and that could mean 45 minutes, an hour to 2 hours in a bomb shelter. And particularly for children, I think we really saw how difficult it can be and disruptive to their educations. One, there's not enough bomb shelters, but two, they're having to actually put classrooms in bomb shelters, and they're often cold and dark, and it's a very difficult way of life for the Ukrainian people. So yeah, it was a big wake-up call to me. It was the first time I had been in that sort of situation with the air raid alerts and bomb shelters. So Rachel, can you talk a bit about just how things have changed over time? And now as we approach 1 year and we look to the future, even just kind of the evolution of the aid package and kind of where as an aid organization we're moving.
So really, really good question. I wish I had a simple answer. My job would be a whole lot easier. The simple answer is that, as far as I can give one, the pattern of the war dictates the needs of the people and therefore our response. However, it's a little bit more complicated than that. So if you look at a map of Ukraine, you're absolutely right in saying the whole of the country has been impacted by the war, not least because of those air raid sirens. But in the west of the country, around Lviv, for example, the physical damage to buildings and property and infrastructure is much, much less severe, hardly any at all, to be honest. However, those are the areas that are now playing host to their fellow countrymen and women. So they are bearing a burden as well, but just not the same physical damage. The further east you go and into those areas that you showed earlier on the map, where The fighting is still fierce, hand to hand, trench warfare, the kind of thing we haven't seen for decades, and which many people, to be honest, thought we'd never see again in Europe. There, the damage to buildings and infrastructure is massive, to the extent that people are already saying there may be some towns, some parts of towns that simply cannot be rebuilt. They will need to be razed to the ground, leveled, all that debris moved away, all that unexploded ordnance cleared away, and then designed again from scratch. It's going to be an absolutely massive job to rebuild Ukraine once we get to a time of peace. And to be honest, there's absolutely no sign of that at the moment. So as those war dynamics shift and people are still moving, very few people are crossing the border anymore. We're really not seeing any refugees now. What we're seeing is smaller movements. People from the east are moving, but not as far west. They're trying to stay closer to their homes. And in part, that's because of the gains that Ukraine made towards the summer last year. So people are beginning to think, well, if the Ukrainian army managed to make those advances before, I don't want to be too far away from the home that I've left, because I might be able to get back in a couple of months. So we're seeing people move again, but not as far. So where we're having to help them, then that changes. What people need changes depending on where they are, the dynamics of the war, and frankly, the weather, the seasons.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So a question that's come in is around the length of the response and how long do you anticipate we'll be responding in Ukraine?
That's always a tough one. For as long as our particular aid and our particular skills and experience are needed and relevant, and it's appropriate for us to stay. That's the kind of get out clause, the umbrella. If I was to try and estimate a date, if things stay as they are now, with essentially a war of attrition in the east, then the main focus of humanitarian shelter response is quite swiftly going to move towards reconstruction. Because in areas that are now relatively safe, that's what's needed, not the kind of sharp-end emergency aid that we provide. Having said that, there are still needs further east for some of that more emergency aid, but then access and security becomes an issue. So I think we literally have to take it month by month. And that's been one of the biggest challenges with this response overall, is we talk about it as a long-term program, but it's really hard to plan long-term. It's essentially a very long acute emergency response. So although I'd love to be able to tell you what I'm going to do in 6 months' time, it would be a guess. So the best I can do is remain as flexible as possible. I suspect that we will do less shelter interventions and more of the kind of household items, the blankets, the sleeping bags, the solar lights, which have proven to be really useful, really popular, and which allow people to stay somewhat mobile.
Yeah. Thank you, Rachel. And as you mentioned, the people in the East, and particularly the most vulnerable, and obviously shifting front lines and the challenge of reaching some of the most vulnerable is something that all agencies are grappling with at this point. Tim, can you talk about how this war zone is different than other conflict areas you've worked in previously?
Well, you mentioned a few of them earlier. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the types of operation that I've been involved in previously have been what international humanitarian law calls non-international armed conflicts. They're insurgencies against the country that's being affected. So, you know, the Afghanistan issue was largely related to an internal sort of terrorist organizations that were involved in acts of violence against the state. Here we've got interstate war, and that is something that is governed by the Geneva Conventions very clearly. And, you know, of course, we're seeing violations of the Geneva Conventions, most likely by both sides, actually. What Rachel said is quite true as well. We're seeing a level of industrial warfare that perhaps many countries in the West predicted would possibly start to not be seen again. And that's interesting in itself. But what you have seen is that although it is industrial scale in the sense that the fighting in the East is extremely intense, In reality, the intensity is not as great as wars historically have been that have been of this nature. So if I saw a statistic the other day about the number of US bombing raids during the Vietnam War, and they were something like 800 sorties a day were flown by US aircraft in that war, and we're not seeing anything like that amount on this front line. So, interestingly, when you're in somewhere like Kyiv and you're worried about whether or not you're going to be the victim of a targeted attack against energy infrastructure that perhaps goes wrong, in reality, weapons are so expensive today that they are actually used quite sparingly in many ways. And although that can still mean that you become the victim of them, what it means is that every time something is thrown down the range by, for instance, Putin's forces in southern Russia, you're talking about a $6.5 million bill to the Russian treasury. That's quite a significant thing, and that's a difference from previous warfare. We don't really have access, of course, at Shelterbox to the sort of intelligence that I would have been able to see in previous roles within the military. So I can't predict as accurately as I would have been able to maybe if I'd been in one of those organizations. But I think what we are seeing is a real sort of running out of capacity on both sides. It's easier for Ukraine to defend actually than it is for Russia to attack, because Russia has to sort of do that on a number of fronts, and it also can't really do that in a hidden way because it can't hide its forces from the sort of satellite surveillance that the West is able to provide Ukraine in modern warfare. So what we're seeing is Putin really having fewer options, and how that will develop over the next few months will be really, really critical. And that's why it's so important for the world to try to ask China and other nations not to intervene on Russia's behalf, because that will inevitably prolong the conflict much longer than its current position.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of questions we've received about the potential for spring offensive and the humanitarian needs that could come along with that. So, as Rachel said, just staying very nimble and flexible in our aid package, but also remaining very much committed to meeting the unique and changing needs of people who've been displaced within Ukraine, which has been a challenge, but it's an absolute priority for our organization.
I mean, interestingly, from the spring offensive point of view, it will be interesting to see what comes of that, because in reality, the most dangerous course of action from our perspective, or from anyone's perspective really, is that a new front is opened up from Belarus, which effectively sort of cuts Kyiv off and perhaps, forces the Ukrainian forces to dissipate such that they're in a position that they can be attacked more readily across the whole front. But in reality, the amount of forces that Russia would have to accumulate on that front is so great that it's almost unrealistic that it could happen. So let's see what is the sort of strategic sort of intent of Russia over the next few months, and how that materializes on the ground.
Okay, thank you both. We are going to shift gears for the final few minutes and talk about another part of our world that the organization has been focused on right now, in addition to obviously the enormous challenges of responding to the war in Ukraine, which we've been doing actively over the past year. We've also been responding to severe weather situations in places like Pakistan. We've also been working across the Lake Chad Basin of Africa and Cameroon, in Syria, in Mozambique, in the Philippines. But we turned our attention, in addition to all of the other global projects, to mounting what will be a very significant response as a result of the series of earthquakes which devastated the southern parts of Turkey and northern Syria. As many of you have seen, there's been tens of thousands of deaths, millions of people who've been displaced. So much of the region has really just been returned to rubble, as you can see, as a result of these earthquakes, series of aftershocks. Shelterbox deployed a response team to the region. They've been working in Turkey, in Gaziantep, and this is a region that we are very familiar with because we are working here routinely. In addition to having responded to earthquakes in Turkey in the past, the longest and largest piece of our work at Shelterbox has been our response to the crisis in Syria. We've been actively responding for over 11 years and continuously responding with programs like our Winterize projects to help families who've been displaced survive the winter. Initially, we were helping many Syrian refugees, and over the past 5+ years, we've really turned our attention internally to IDPs within Syria. So we do have long-term partners that we've worked with in Syria, like Bahar Organization and Relief Aid. And we do feel that our organization is well positioned to be able to respond to meet some of the urgent shelter and household needs of these families, because we've worked there for so long. But it is also a very challenging area to work. Initially, it was a very long-term search and rescue as people were recovering family members and searching for family and friends. But we have been able to begin to mount a response, and that started with an initial airlift of tents, hundreds of shelter box relief tents, which will serve as temporary homes for families who have been displaced. We were fortunate to receive a free airlift from Turkish Airlines and drew down on a supply of tents from our Panama warehouse. We're also sending additional tents in from Europe. We had some aid already pre-positioned for our winter projects in Syria. And so with our partner Relief Aid, initially able to start to begin to deploy a set of children's clothing. So that includes things like coats and mittens and scarves. But this is going to be a heavy lift for our organization. Our intention is to respond both in Turkey, where we have tents on the ground, and also work to address some of the urgent humanitarian needs in Syria as well. We have one of our teammates, actually Martin Strutton, who's working in Turkey now. He was actually supposed to deploy with us to Ukraine. He was part of the Ukraine team, but I know he's been working really hard with the team on this response. And that includes working extensively in Turkey with our Rotary partners. So Rotary has been an absolute tie that binds our ability to be able to respond to this disaster, and they've been instrumental in helping coordinate with us to be able to mount a response. Rachel, anything else that you want to offer about this piece of work now and what you're hearing from your team?
Well, there's one connection between this tragedy in Turkey and Syria and Ukraine, which is that our main supplier for both those responses is actually based in Gaziantep. So one of our first ports of call, because we've been working with them for a long time when we heard of this disaster, was just to check that they were all okay. Happily, they are. And amazingly, within about 24 hours, they were up and running and saying, we're ready. We're going to start the production lines going as quickly as we can. So our colleague Sancha has been out there working with them, meeting with them. That enabled us to get the production lines going for this response, having already got the aid out to Ukraine. So both things were happening simultaneously through this one supplier. They're absolutely amazing. They're called Uzmanlar. I know that the idea is to keep projects going through Bahar and Relief Aid on the Syrian side of the border, and with Rotary, fingers crossed, it's all going ahead on the Turkish side of the border. That'll be 3 projects up and running for the earthquake response. That's a lot of moving parts all at once. So yeah, the teams have been absolutely flat out, working really hard to get this all going as quickly as possible.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Rachel. I know we're on our final minute, and I want to say a big thank you to everyone who's contributed to the relief efforts of ShelterBox over the past year. So many of you stepped up to enable this important work. It's the only way that we do it as a privately funded charitable organization. You've really enabled us to do so much. In Ukraine, as I mentioned, it has been to help 37,000 plus people with shelter and or household needs. Our programs this winter will reach another 30,000. I know so many people have asked me, what struck me the most about working in Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. And I really feel like the whole world has been in absolute awe of the resilience of the Ukrainian people. And despite the horrors of this war, despite losing family and friends and livelihoods and homes, they remain absolutely courageous and resilient. And I know as an aid organization, we remain absolutely committed to really enabling them to continue with their lives during what may be the most difficult time of their life. So thank you for enabling us and entrusting us with your charitable support to be able to do this work. In many instances, it is very life-saving. And thank you to many of you who've also stepped up to help us now with response efforts in places like Turkey and Syria. We would welcome more questions. I know we're kind of running out of time, but I've put my email address up on the slide. So feel free to reach out. And again, thank you so much, Tim and Rachel. Thank you for joining us today. We appreciate your expertise in these areas, and thank you for all the extraordinary humanitarian work that you've been doing around the world. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thanks.